Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I hope you're safe and healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of virtual conversations about issues of critical importance to America and to the world. And welcome also to today's program, the US, China, and Russia in the Time of Pandemic. In the 1951 sci-fi classic, The Day the Earth Stood Still, our planet is visited by an alien spacecraft bearing a giant robot and an emissary in human form with a very sobering message. Mend your differences or face obliteration. The movie concludes with world leaders pondering their choice. It'd be wonderful to believe, whether in the form of a global pandemic or a threat from outer space, that in fact the world would mend its differences. But by the looks of things, the rivalries and disputes have only grown, certainly magnified in the time of pandemic, and they're likely to continue, accelerating pre-existing patterns of tension and competition. Nowhere, it seems, are those tensions more evident than U.S. relations with both a rising China and a declining Russia, both eager to reassert themselves, both regionally and globally. It may well be that these three powers will emerge weakened by the current pandemic. To paraphrase Carnegie's own Alexander Bonhoeff, COVID is a crisis for all, but could it be an opportunity for some? And this sense of vulnerability and loss, compounded by three leaders focused on their own internal politics, may make them more, not less, eager to assert themselves competitively. And in this case, that assertion isn't part of a dynamic triangle where the US can easily align with one, Russia, or China, and play it against the other. The Sino-Russia partnership is a good deal more than an axis of convenience, and one of, if not the principal adhesives in that relationship, is an effort to check US influence both regionally and globally. All of this, it seems to me, presents a pretty grim picture, and a list of issues from Hong Kong to trade to Ukraine to Uyghurs to election interference to South China Seas to Syria to Afghan bounties to Taiwan can make your head spin. And it makes you wonder what space exists or might exist for episodic cooperation between the US and Russia and the US and China. Every Russia and China expert I talk to seems to roll their eyes at the very mention of the prospects for any fundamental change in relations with Washington. And will anything change depending on how the wheel turns here in November? Who would Russia and China want to see as the next president, and why? As usual, more questions than answers, but fortunately we have three extraordinary folks here to answer them. Evan Feigenbaum is the Vice President for Studies at Carnegie, where he oversees research in Washington, Beijing, and New Delhi. Between 2001 and 2009, Evan held key positions dealing with South Asia, Central Asia, and China at the Department of State. Eugene Rumer, currently director of Carnegie's Russia-Eurasia program, is the former National Intelligence Officer for Russia-Eurasia at the NIC. And Susan Thornton is currently senior fellow at Yale Law School and former Assistant Secretary for East Asia and Pacific Affairs at the Department of State. All three have had deep experience as practitioners and thought leaders in their fields, and I think they have a unique capacity to approach Russia, China, and US policy with just the right balance of thematic altitude on one hand and the granular on the other. Each will speak for no more than 5 minutes or so. I'll make sure of that. We'll do a moderated round of conversation and then on to your questions. We will have a live Q&A afterwards. To ask a question, use the live chat feature in YouTube. Email us at pressoffice@ceip.org or tweet us at Carnegie Endow using hashtag Carnegie Connects. So with that, Evan, the virtual space is over to you.
Great. Well, thanks, Aaron. It's a pleasure to be with you and Gene and Susan. I guess I'll start with the US-China relationship, and I'll give you the headline at the top. From my vantage point, this is a relationship that's basically in free fall. And after about 25 years in this business, I'm having trouble seeing the floor. I think the core of it is really a change in the relationship between economics and security. And I say that because if you go back to the modern inception of the US-China relationship, it's in Richard Nixon's February 1972 visit to Beijing. And that was a point in time when the US and China were fighting a proxy war in Vietnam, and China was still just crawling out of the mass hysteria of the Cultural Revolution. So even from the very inception of the relationship, these were two countries that had military differences, clashing security concepts, and obvious differences of political system and ideology. And we've had 40 plus years where Chinese communism and American constitutionalism have repeatedly clashed and collided. But what began to change over time was that a path of economic integration opened up between the two. And particularly after China came in the World Trade Organization in 2001, the relationship was increasingly characterized by flows of five things: goods, capital, people, technology, and data. And the idea, I think, that many people had was not that economic integration would make those security and political differences disappear like magic, but rather that economic integration would mitigate the pernicious effects of that security competition. But what's happened is, rather than economic integration mitigating security competition, the security differences are actually getting worse, as you said in the setup, in the Taiwan Strait, in the South China Sea, all around Asia. So the US and China are enormously economically integrated. They got a $700 billion trading relationship. There's more than $100 billion of US foreign direct investment stock in China. A few years ago, there was something like 50, 60 billion in Chinese deal flow into the United States. But notwithstanding that, the security competition's intensifying. But here's the thing. It's not just that it's intensifying, it's that those economic relationships are now being refracted back through the prism of the security competition, because the security issues are beginning to bleed into everything else. And that really, to my mind, is the sea change that we've had over the last 3-4 years. So I'll give you just three quick examples. If you look at flows of people, flows of data, flows of technology, in all of those areas, the national security frame that the US and China have on each other is attenuating those flows in ways that could deintegrate these two countries. So on people, for instance, the United States now has a new set of visa policies in place that are designed to make it harder for Chinese students and scholars in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics to come here and study in any area or do a degree program that touches an emerging and foundational technology. Because those technologies, things like artificial intelligence-enabled applications, are increasingly and intrinsically dual and multi-use. Same thing on data. There's now a debate about whether to ban the app TikTok here in the United States, something that's very popular with teenagers and younger people who make videos, because the data, including their personal data, goes back to a company, TikTok, that's owned by a Chinese parent, ByteDance. So what's really happening is, it's not that the security tensions are new, but the things that integrated these two countries are now being refracted through this very some military prism. And where it's going is toward a deintegration that will have long-term and enduring and pernicious effects that we can talk about, because it's going to catch a lot of third countries betwixt and between those two.
Fascinating point of departure, Evan. What used to bind the relationship seems to, at least those instruments, those elements now seem to drive it apart. Gene.
Yeah. Well, delighted to be in such distinguished company. And I think you'll see some familiar themes in what I'm about to say with what Evan said so eloquently. It's accepted now that the relationship between Russia and the United States is at its worst since who knows when. In the past 30 years, since the Cold War ended, that was the major milestone we thought that would really transform the relationship. But in one respect, I would say the situation we're in is really not that different, in that although the relationship once again is at its lowest point, we're following in the footsteps of previous post-Cold War American administrations that essentially went in circles and cycles, trying to fix the relationship, starting out on a high note and ending on a very low note, each for its period of time at the lowest point since the Cold War. So just immediately prior to the Trump administration, The Obama administration began the relationship in 2009, hoping to restart a partnership between the United States and Russia with then new President Dmitry Medvedev. It was Partnership for Modernization. I'm not going to go into details of this, but the relationship ended in 2009 at the lowest point. Sorry, in 2016, 2017, at the lowest point since the Cold War. Before that, the Bush administration tried to improve the relationship, and early on in 2001 announced a new partnership. Yet the relationship in 2009, once again, going backwards chronologically, was at its lowest point after the war between Russia and Georgia. And before that, the Clinton administration essentially followed the same pattern, starting on a high note in 1993, ending on a very low note in the beginning of 2001. You'll remember this since you were at the State Department at the time. And I think it's fair to say that throughout these 30 years of bilateral relations since the end of the Cold War, we have proceeded to the present day effectively in our dealings with Russia on the basis of three fundamental assumptions, or hopes rather. One was that Russia would reform itself and become a country that's not dissimilar from us, in a sense, democratic or with an open political system, with a market economy, and accepting a security architecture for Europe and Eurasia that we, the United States, in cooperation with our allies, have designed. Well, that clearly has not happened, and in effect, Russia has failed to meet our expectations on all three of those counts. And I would say that if there's anything good to come out of the current very difficult point in the bilateral relationship, is that after 2014, after the crisis in Ukraine, or with Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea and the breakdown in the relationship between Moscow and Washington, it's fair to say that those assumptions no longer apply, and we should relook at them and really think hard about what really is essential in this relationship, what is at stake here for us. And Evan said previously, I heard him say that you can't talk about what's at stake for us with China without really talking about the relationship with Asia as a whole. I think the agenda with Russia is really considerably smaller. So we should be asking ourselves the questions that have become almost proverbial in our own domestic political conversation. I would say that the issues that really we should be focusing on are, what are the red lines? When do the Russians cross them in a way that really affects our fundamental core interests? And what are, if I may use the term, areas for quid pro quo? Where can we do deals with Russia? Because after all, we're going to have to be doing deals with Russia in years and decades to come. And I would single out several fundamental issues as I see them that are absolutely critical for our bilateral relationship in the years and decades to come, probably. One, I would single out strategic stability. We are approaching the end of arms control. The framework that we inherited from Soviet American competition in the area of nuclear and conventional arms control, that's practically gone. It looks like the renewal of the New START treaty is very unlikely. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, I believe, spoke about it just a day or two ago. And that's an area where we're approaching the point where we'll be in an unrestrained, unrestricted arms race with a host of new technologies entering the strategic stability equation, so to speak, that are likely to prove highly destabilizing. The second area I would focus on is the military-to-military relationship. Our military and the Russian military operate now in close proximity in the Baltic, over the Black Sea, and certainly in the Middle East. And managing that relationship, oftentimes in very confined airspace and at sea, is something that is essential for the stability and security of Europe, but also other regions and our bilateral relationship. And three, I think we should relook at the toolkit that we have applied in our relationship with Russia. Lately, it's been reduced essentially to sanctions. Russians do something in Syria and we impose sanctions, or rather they don't do something and we impose sanctions. They do something in Venezuela, we impose more sanctions. And it's about time that we ask ourselves, is that enough? Is that really the only tool that we can apply in dealing with a country that spans the better part of Europe and Asia, and has the ability to wipe out the United States with a flip of a switch? So I would say we need to rethink our diplomatic approach to Russia in the years to come. I think betting on the idea that Putin somehow will leave the stage and really with that the relationship will change fundamentally is an unrealistic one. And even beyond Putin, Russia is here to stay, and we need to deal with it as it is, not as we want it to be.
Gene,
thank you.
Fascinating presentation. And I want to return in the Q&A to the whole issue of red lines, because it gets to the issue of what really are our vital interests with respect to Russia and to China as well. Susan.
Thanks, Aaron. Great to be with you, Evan, Gene. I'm going to talk a little bit about how China views the U.S. and how China views Russia, and then maybe if we have time, what the U.S. should and shouldn't be doing about all that. But I'd just like to make the point at the outset that China has been waiting for many years for the U.S. to turn its sights on it and to be concerned about China's rise. I think, at the beginning of the 21st century, China had expected, actually, because of its size, because of the U.S. hegemonic position, and because of what the Chinese call this Cold War hangover or Cold War thinking, that the U.S. Would, in time, come to sort of focus on China as an external threat. And we're, I guess, probably pleasantly surprised that in the period of the George W. Bush administration, that did not come to pass. The U.S. became preoccupied with counterterrorism efforts and then the global financial crisis. But I think China is not surprised that the U.S. is focusing in on it now and sees this in part as a structural inevitability. I think George W. Bush and Obama would have liked to work with China more on various international issues, but China was not ready at that point to invest in global public goods. It was very focused on developing its economy, on its modernization, and it kept talking about this period of strategic opportunity. It coined the term peaceful rise in order to make people think that, it was not interested in being externally aggressive. But I think with the advent of Donald Trump, the Chinese thought they could initially work with Trump, that he was transactional, that they could do deals, and he wasn't values-based in his approach. But what they failed to detect was that he really wasn't that interested in the substance, that he was, very much prone to changing his view and didn't want to be bound by any constraints, which made the whole relationship very unpredictable and pretty uncomfortable for the Chinese, obviously. They don't like that kind of unpredictability and chaos, especially when they're trying to manage their internal pressures, of which there are many. So I think the bottom line is that with the advent of Trump, with the advent of this sort of across-the-board bipartisan harder line toward China, the Chinese have adopted the view that the U.S. has determined that it is going to be part of the U.S. national purpose to contain China and to block its advancement. And I think that it doesn't really matter whether or not Trump is reelected or Biden is elected. The Chinese now, it will be very difficult to dislodge this view inside China that the U.S. is bent on sort of a posture of blocking China's advancement. I think the way China's thinking about Russia at the moment, and we can talk more about this. I'd be curious to hear what Gene and Evan think, but this is, in my view, the U.S.-China, the China-Russia entente, if you will call it that, is based mainly on two factors. The first one is this economic driver that has really become more prominent in the last couple of decades, and where I think the Chinese have now become a kind of imbalanced, driver of the train that is a bit uncomfortable probably for Russia. But China has a lot of cards to play in the economic relationship between the two powers. And so I think that will continue to play out and continue to create both synergies and tensions in the relationship. I think the second big driver, of course, is the convergence in the attitudes of the two governments about what the West, and i.e. the U.S., is doing. They don't like a lot of the positions that the U.S. is taking. They don't like a lot of things we're doing in the international space. And I think in this respect of this driver, Russia is more in the lead and China is more of a follower. I think China sees Russia as more of a risk taker in this kind of back and forth with the West. They hang back. They're a little bit uncomfortable with some of Russia's more aggressive plays. But I would say I think the Chinese are taking tutelage from Russia, are learning, and are starting to step into this arena gingerly, maybe. So that's something that we should be watching. I think the bottom line is that this is not really a natural alliance, and that the U.S. and its friends should not be taking actions that push the two toward one another. And that's something that I've been increasingly concerned about in recent years. On what should the U.S. be doing about all of this, let me speak first to China, because that's where I've been spending most of my time. And Gene has already spoken eloquently to what the U.S. should be doing on Russia, and I agree completely with his observations, actually. I think the U.S. is in danger of misanalyzing the problem with China. We want to see this as an ideological competition, a military competition, or Cold War redux kind of thing. But I think, we are failing to appreciate the degree to which it's an economic competition, and we are failing in our prescriptions to respond to that challenge. And Evan listed a number of things that sort of get to the essence of what our response is to what we're seeing in China, which I think speaks to the sort of misplaced emphasis on security in terms of how we're seeing our economic competitiveness and the policy prescriptions that that's leading to. So I think, all in all, the U.S. needs to do a lot more thinking about what its domestic prescriptions will be that are going to best fit it to pursue the challenge that these two countries are posing. Our diplomacy really needs to be reinvigorated and re-energized, and to be a lot more realistic and a lot more thoughtful in order to sort of pursue what's going to be in the interest of the U.S. going forward. And I think, Gene said, obviously the U.S. has a lot of things it's going to need to be working with Russia on in the coming decades. The same is true, obviously, for China. If we just think about the current moment that people are all being affected by, the pandemic and the economic fallout from the pandemic. These are two areas that are basically constitute a double crisis for the world, and the U.S. and China should certainly be pooling their resources and their efforts to try to combat this. And so I think that's basically a vivid example of what we're missing in our current approach. And I'll just stop there.
Susan, thank you. In fact, I want to, my first question to the three of you, it actually flows from Susan's reference to the pandemic. Again, Alexander Banoff from the Moscow Center talked about COVID as a crisis for all three powers. Who, in your judgment, let me ask you this, how have Russia and China coped with pandemic? Who has emerged in a better position to exploit what there is to exploit with respect to COVID-19? Or has it been a net loss for both powers? Gene, could I ask you to start first on Russia?
I think it's been a net loss, as you said, to Russia. And we're seeing evidence of that immediately just in the last couple of days. I don't know if our audience is familiar with the recent developments in the Russian Far East, but the governor of a major Far Eastern region in Khabarovsk was arrested and in an unprecedented on multiple charges of heinous crimes committed allegedly 15 years ago. And we're seeing something that we have not seen in quite some time, a spontaneous demonstration in the regional capital, Khabarovsk, in support of this governor, who apparently is not the nicest guy in Moscow, not a committed Democrat and so on. But I would argue that this is a situation that is aggravated by the general dissatisfaction with the government's performance in the pandemic. I mean, Russia has been in sort of economic difficulties for quite some time. If I'm not mistaken, for the past 6 years or so, the standard of living has declined. But the pandemic has really dealt a blow that has laid bare a number of major deficiencies in the ability of the government to deal with these kinds of crises. And not that Russians have a lot of expectations in terms of government support these days, but this, I think, was a catalytic if I'm probably not the right chemistry, but a contextual aggravating condition to prompt apparently tens of thousands of people, if you believe the internet, to go out into the streets and protest the Kremlin action. So I think across the board, there's a conversation on Russian internet about the shortcomings, the lack of a safety net, and overall, further blow, I would say, to Putin's claim of stability, better conditions, security, and so on.
So it poses a certain kind of legitimacy crisis for Putin's management of the state, which is perceived to be the agent that is to, redeem the Russian people from this terrible virus.
Certainly, and especially when it comes on the heels of a referendum, essentially to extend Putin's term in office to at least 2036. Everybody considers it, a life presidency, president for life. So there is this kind of stark contrast between conditions in the country and the Kremlin's attempt to establish its legitimacy through a popular referendum that they didn't want to call a referendum, just a vote, which by all accounts was, let's just say, not up to the standards of referenda in normal democratic societies.
Right. Evan, let me ask you, you've written about the U.S.-China relationship as, I think, to quote you, managed enmity. Now, how does that apply? I think that's very wise, actually. How does that apply to the management of COVID from China's perspective? Have they sought to gain?
I think, look, first, if we're going to be blunt about it, I mean, with very few exceptions like New Zealand and Taiwan and maybe South Korea, there really aren't any systems around the world that have covered themselves in glory over the last 4 months. And the three places that we're talking about, China, Russia, and the United States, haven't really covered themselves in glory either. There have been a lot of mistakes and missteps in all three of those capitals. Is China the winner? Hardly. The China's economy contracted 6.8% in the first quarter. And China's facing a variety of really acute economic and structural challenges. It's interesting what they've done in the last month or two, because it says a lot about China under Xi Jinping. We make so much of China's growth, but the government has declined to set a growth target for this year, partly because in China they don't like setting targets that they're going to miss, but also because the focus in Xi's China has really shifted away from growth for growth's sake toward what I would call welfare and quality of life indicators, which in the aftermath of COVID means employment. And the Prime Minister of China, Li Keqiang, in his last government work report, talked about China's focus shifting to what he called an employment-first policy. So China's not dancing here. They're dealing with, first, an economic contraction, but second, with real threats in the labor market, particularly the places they're most vulnerable, white collar workers and college graduates in the first instance, and migrant workers in the second. So that's within China.
Mm.
Now, they're trying to make the most of it internationally by leveraging the things that they think they've done right in terms of mitigating the impacts of the virus. And that includes large-scale mass testing after a lot of early missteps and things that I think are functions of really flaws in the Chinese system. They've tried to manage the impact a little bit better. And I think there are a lot of places around the world that look to China now to share some of those experiences. One question that we're going to face is who gets to a vaccine first, because if it's China, that will inevitably change the image of China around the world in the context of COVID. But it also raises some fundamental questions about cooperation with China. And that's, you mentioned my use of the term managed enmity. It kind of gets to the US-China dynamic and something you said in the setup. You know, if the US and China cannot work together in the worst global public health crisis in over 100 years, and the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s, it raises a very fundamental question, which is what the heck can they work together on? And if the answer to that question is not very much, then despite the rhetoric of being in a competition, this is not really a strategic competition. This is what I call managed enmity, where the two sides are not only not working together, they're actively obstructing each other around the world and doing it potentially without some guardrails. And that's problematic because, to be honest, Aaron, if you look at the history of US-China crisis coordination, despite all of the tension, and Susan knows this, despite all of the tension that these two countries have had, they have dealt pretty effectively with collective responses to scary transnational threats, whether it was the financial crisis in 2008, it was Ebola in 2014, and they've done it even at moments of high security tension. And so if you pull that thread and you look where we are now, it suggests the possibility that these two aren't going to be able to work together on anything productive. And frankly, that leaves other countries around the world stuck. And what I think you're going to see happen is third countries will not simply accept their fate. And they will try to define third, fourth, and fifth alternatives where they become the drivers. We've seen this on trade rules in Asia, where the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, it doesn't include China or the United States. That may start to happen on data, on vaccine development, on public health standards. And as an American, I don't think that's a very good place for the United States to be. And I don't think it's productive for the world for the two largest economies not be working together on some of those things.
Right. But in order to change the current headline into a trend line, you really will need an enormous amount of something. I mean, if the unipolar moment has gone the way of the dodo, then what you are introducing is in managed enmity is a new bipolarity, a negative new bipolarity, that the US and China will emerge as the two most powerful actors on the international stage, however constrained, and they've got to figure out or not a way to deal with one another. So Susan, let me ask you on the pandemic question. I mean, has China's image suffered any sort of permanent damage as a consequence of the whole COVID business, Wuhan and the rest?
Yeah, I think, I would agree with Evan that neither the US or China is going to emerge from this crisis as the winner. China definitely has had its image suffer, partly from the missteps that came at the beginning, but also just from the fact that, people around the world, they may or may not know what happened in Wuhan. They may be cognizant of the details or not, but they know that the whole virus started in China. And that, is going to affect people because this virus is going to negatively affect every single person in the world. And it started in China. So that is something the Chinese are going to have to reckon with and that they're worried about, I think. That's why you see them making these ham-handed efforts to give supplies and try to, intercede in many countries where they obviously don't have the health systems to deal with this. But I think the other thing that comes up in the context of COVID is this question about deglobalization. What's happening to our international institutions, the international system? And Russia and China certainly have a major interest in that. It may not be exactly the same as the U.S. interest, which actually, frankly, at the moment is also not that clear. Hopefully, if we have a change in leadership in the U.S., we will attach ourselves to the international system and try to restore and reinvigorate a lot of those institutions and repair them. But at the moment, the big question that comes up in the minds of many people around the world with COVID and the economic crisis is, geez, maybe globalization was a terrible idea. And yeah, we've all had a long spell of relatively peaceful security environment. We've had a long spell of relatively prosperous, at least some poverty alleviation, relatively prosperous economics. But, now maybe we're entering into a period where this globalization thing has gone too far and we need to retrench. And I think, China definitely does not want to see deglobalization, decoupling, and a return to sort of, divided spheres of economic interaction for sure. So I think, they're really struggling with how to move forward. They have a backup plan, and they have a backup plan to the backup plan. And that's a thing that I wish we had.
Well, that would require a good deal of, it's not a comment on the current administration, but my question is a comment on all administrations, not just dealing with China and Russia, but with the world in general. And that is our capacity to think through what our vital interests really are. Vital interests as opposed to discretionary interests. Discretionary interests being things we could live with. Vital interests being things, frankly, we cannot. And it's Gene's point about red lines. So I want to ask each of you, 2 on China, 1 on Russia. Identify for everybody on this call, in your judgment, 2 or 3 absolute red lines for the United States with respect. Let's start with, Evan, let's start with you. Red lines that if crossed, the United States simply cannot tolerate.
Well, look, I think American interests in Asia actually have been pretty consistent for 150 years. Didn't start with the People's Republic of China in the last 5 years. So it's essentially no regional hegemon that tries to exclude the United States, no exclusionary blocks, freedom of navigation, open regionalism. That's what the U.S. has stood for from the open door through the Cold War through the present. And frankly, if you pull that thread, you can immediately see where the red lines are.
Right. I want to pull that. How are we doing in each of those boxes?
Well, hang on. I think, so first of all, the red lines are a China that tries to exclude the United States from the region, a China that tries to forge exclusionary blocks in the region, a China that tries to construct an Asia that's built on a closed system rather than an open regionalism, and a China that constricts freedom of navigation. So those are essentially where the red lines are. Now, the U.S. talks a lot about those things, but the reality is if you look at U.S. policy, particularly in this administration, and I served in the Bush administration, but I think there's a structural problem for the United States going back 25 years. The United States is progressively becoming excluded from the region because it is not as central as it presumes itself to be. And the United States confuses right now a lot of long-term structural changes in Asia with short-term Sino-centric things, by which I mean that the United States basically has an attitude now, but not really a strategy for dealing with these things. If it had a strategy, it would be the proponent of open regionalism, the standard setter on trade, investment, data, all the things that are going to drive the economic integration of the region. But what's happening is I see the United States withdrawing from regional trade agreements. I see the United States allowing China or other Asian countries not called China to set the standards. And I see the United States essentially exempting itself from a process in the region that is going to make this a very different part of the world 10 years from now than it was 10 years from now ago. It is not sufficient for the United States to claim to compete simply by being a security provider for the region and sailing boats around the South China Sea and sailing and flying airplanes around.
Right.
Being a security provider is important because it's the security that allows for the economic prosperity. But America's own prosperity is tied to being a standard-setting nation, and we've withdrawn from that role. Right, that's not consistent with American interests over 100 years.
Right. So quickly, those 3 red lines have turned pink.
Well, I think China's pushing the envelope in all of those areas, and the nature abhors a vacuum. And it's not that the United States has enabled it, because China's become much more assertive and even aggressive on these things. But the United States is not formulating the kind of strategy that would either push back China's efforts or set a framework with other partners that create a context within which China would be constrained and calculate its own interests somewhat differently.
Fair enough.
That's not what I see happening.
All right. So before I give Susan a chance to answer that or embellish or whatever she wants to do with the red line question, Jean, 2 or 3 red lines with respect to Russia, Putin's behavior.
Well, I would say that, in addition to what Evan mentioned about the freedom of navigation and preventing hegemonic power rising in Eurasia, I would, in the specific Russian context, mention the security of the homeland and security of the American people. And this, in the context of Russia, or the bilateral relationship, has to do, of course, with our strategic nuclear relationship and managing it so that our deterrent capabilities are maintained at a level that ensures that stable strategic relationship. We can go into details later on, but I think that's our top priority in the relationship with Russia. I would also bring into this the security of our treaty allies. And again, this applies to some of our treaty allies or our treaty allies in Asia, but also in the context of Russia, primarily with Europe. Now, I think you're leading me or pushing me toward mentioning interference in our domestic politics.
Indeed.
And here I would draw a distinction between what Russians apparently did, or we know they did in 2016, which I do not consider to be, in a sense, a red line and something that would involve, on their part, tampering with our electoral systems. That would be a red line. But simply stealing information and feeding information or fake news into our domestic political context, I think is much more of a problem for our own domestic politics than for our bilateral relationship with Russia.
Well, there's a lot more to say about that. We could take another hour to deal with that. I'm sorry, Gene?
Unlike with China, we don't really have a robust economic relationship with Russia. I think our bilateral trade is something on the order of $25 to $30 billion a year, which is what, 1/10 or less than that. Less than that, 1/20th of the bilateral relationship with China. Is that correct? And I think it's likely to stay that way. Although, well, I think I'll stop at that and we'll talk about it a bit later.
Thanks, Susan.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. I mean, this is a key question, and one of my hobby horses has been that the U.S. government has a terrible time trying to define and articulate its key priorities and interests. And so I think that has been true in spades with the China relationship, and it is actually, I would contend, part of the core of what has brought us to such unsatisfactory point in our bilateral discussions. But I think, at the end of the day, and I don't really like to talk about red lines, but we are lucky with China, I think, and probably also with Russia, and that we all agree that we don't want to have a military conflict. And it gets to the issue of strategic stability that Jean was talking about. Right. The problem is that, given the international environment and changing power structures, we have different spheres of reality about what that is going to impose. And I think Evan, spoke very articulately to sort of what we think we need to do in Asia and what is actually happening there and how much leverage we have to control what's happening there. I think probably going forward, we need to talk a little bit about what red lines look like in the economic sphere, especially with respect to China. And I don't think we've been very clear, certainly not in any of the economic negotiations that I was a part of with China, about what our kind of prioritization is. And I think that's also a function of sort of the way our system is set up to have sort of bottom-up input, lots of different interest groups, lots of competition. So this issue of competition in the economic sphere is going to be very important, and how we work further toward articulating what the U.S. role in the world is going to be with respect to the international system, what our economic fundamentals and principles are going to look like going forward. I think that's going to be a key part of determining how we go forward with China, at least, and probably other countries as well.
Thank you. Speaking of red lines, to the two of you, Evan and Susan, I'm assuming Hong Kong is not a red line for the United States. Is China's policy toward Taiwan? Could it be?
Well, I'll go first. I mean, China has made it clear from the very beginning of the relationship that this is the only issue on which the U.S. and China have a fundamentally existential difference or question. And so I think, for people, I mean, the question really is, we know that China cares a lot about Taiwan. I think the question that I hope Evan will answer is, how much does the U.S. care about Taiwan, and is that calculus evolving or changing?
Evan, the door is open.
Well, I think what's striking about the U.S. relationship with Taiwan is how little the U.S. is investing to try to help Taiwan, in particular, make its economy more robust. Taiwan is structurally challenged in a whole variety of ways that actually weaken its ability to sustain itself over the long term into the future. This is an economy that should be very innovative, but where the scope and scale of innovation has actually shrunk. It's underinvested in a lot of its technological comparative advantages. And so, for all the U.S. professions of support for Taiwan, the U.S. should be doing a lot more, whether it's a trade agreement with Taiwan or, frankly, opening up the pipeline for a different kind of technology relationship to give Taiwan the economy it needs, not for right now, but for 5 to 10 years from now. And, those are the kinds of policy steps that I think are underinvested in the U.S. discussion about Taiwan. It's largely been a security discussion.
Yeah. And what about human rights, humanitarian issues? The current administration at times seems to have emptied the frame of U.S. foreign policy from a lot of moral or ethical considerations, although they've just imposed sanctions on a key Politburo member with regard to the Uyghurs. I mean, to what degree is that a key American national interest? That question for Jean as well, with respect to managing our relationship with these two powers.
Well, I'll go first. I mean, I think it's a key American interest to defend and to speak out for in defense of human rights practices, et cetera, whether it be China, Russia, any country, really. But the question is sort of in the prioritization that we talked about, and on the scale of sort of leverage, what can you bring to bear on this issue? Certainly, I think the reasonable criticism of the Trump administration on this score not only is that they haven't raised it, but they certainly have not worked with other partners and like-minded friends to sort of try to maximize our leverage on these issues and bring them up in multiple different fora and in multiple different ways. I mean, it's been very, very low profile and very unilateral, I would say. And so, yeah. I mean, I think that's a difference that we will probably see going forward with a different administration in the U.S. Because I think this is a bedrock issue for U.S. foreign policy, and it'll continue to be raised.
Yeah, I guess it'll be raised. The question is, what kind of priority has it ever been for American policymakers, and going forward, what kind of priority will it be, even if you got a different administration? Let's take a couple questions from the virtual space out there. One question, and there were articles both in the Post and Times, is on this emerging accord however you want to describe it, between China and Iran. Would either of you like to add or comment? I know we don't know a lot about this, the detail, but is this real or Memorex? What is this? Is this something of consequence?
You really date yourself, Aaron.
Memorex, wow.
That goes back a long way. I know.
Well, I'll just start by saying, I was in the Obama administration when we did the Iran nuclear accord and worked on getting the Chinese to participate more actively in that agreement and to actually contribute to some aspects of the final agreement. And certainly in the wake of the nuclear agreement, there was an expectation that China was going to be approaching Iran. And certainly, China gets a lot of oil from Iran, has always gotten a lot of oil. It's very important to China's calculus on its diversification of its energy sources, given that China is an energy poor state, obviously. So, and with the Belt and Road and other infrastructure projects going in Eurasia, it was obvious that Iran was going to need infrastructure. So this was a very symbiotic kind of match on the economic front, especially. Now, given what's happened to the Iran nuclear accord, given what's happened with the sanctions regime, they've apparently, if this document is real, been negotiating this for quite some time and it hasn't been finalized. So we don't really know what the details of the agreement, if there is a pending agreement, would look like. And we don't know really what the attitude of the Chinese is toward this. But so I think, we'll have to wait and see.
At a minimum, it's clearly an effort to demonstrate that Tehran has quote unquote other options. But on balance, in comparison with sanctions, Western sanctions and relations with Europe, may well end up being a key to an empty room. We have a question from Paul here of the Center for the National Interest, who asks, to what extent are Russia and China collaborating? This is a good one, but maybe impossible to answer, on influence operations. Gene talked about it briefly within the United States. Does the China-Russia partnership, entente, whatever you want to call it, include intelligence cooperation on how to divide, distract, undermine democracy and order in the Republic?
Is that a question for me?
Question for anybody, since it's China and Russia.
Well, I don't think we, hello, Paul.
Thanks, Paul.
Don't have really the necessary knowledge to answer this question definitively, but I would say that it serves both Russian and Chinese, if I may venture into the area of Susan and Evan. It serves their interest to show that American democracy is not perfect, that democracy can be extremely messy, to the point of being debilitating, as I think some of the outlets that they support have argued. Firm authoritarian governments have the upper hand, as they would like to argue. So I think it strengthens their approach to domestic politics.
Would anyone care to comment? We have a question from Todd Lefko on YouTube. What impact will the changes in artificial intelligence have upon U.S. relations with Russia and China? I mean, this is a vast area. Anybody want to offer a brief comment or two? Because I have one final question for the three of you.
I can. I think it's having a substantial impact on the U.S.-China economic and technology relationship, because things like AI-enabled applications are intrinsically dual and multi-use. You can use the same technologies that you use to train a surveillance camera for a lot of public benefit as well. And so really what's happened is, if you think about the flow of innovations, from the 1940s to the 1960s, it was mostly military innovation that was driving commercial innovation. So you had these war babies, British radar, American computing, German rocketry, American atomic bombs. Those things drove a lot of commercial innovation up through the 1960s. After the 1960s, the flow of innovations really flipped. And so it was commercial microelectronics and semiconductors that really had spin-on effects back into weapons innovation. But if you look at the emerging and foundational technologies of the future, AI-enabled applications, quantum computing, new synthetic and composite materials, biotech and new pharmaceutical innovations. A lot of things, these things really do have multiple uses and are intrinsically not just dual use, multiple use. And so it's refracting, as I said, if you go back to where I started, back through this national security prism, because it's becoming harder for the US to think about those things as separable. And so that's one reason why the United States is not just using its export controls against China in new and creative ways, but it's extraterritorializing them to go after third countries and companies in third-party entities to try to attenuate the flow of these things to China and, frankly, try to attenuate its progress. So things like AI are going to have a very substantial impact because it's going to, as I said, securitize and extraterritorialize things like the technology relationship that were thought of over the last 20 years, mainly through a commercial prism. And that really reflects the trend line in the US-China relationship writ large. It's very hard to deintegrate those two systems, though. The flow of AI talent to the United States is not just substantial, it's incredibly substantial. And so is the flow of capital around AI. So deintegration, as Susan put it, is going to be pretty complicated.
Yeah. Thanks, Evan. Okay, we're nearly at the end of the hour. One final question to the three of you, but be brief if you can. You've been asked to write a memo to the next president. What is the one thing about Russia and or China that successive administrations have fundamentally failed to understand? The one big picture, the one thing, as Billy Crystal said. What is that one thing, if you had to identify it, that the next president needs to know in the way of misconceptions that need to be discarded? Susan, start with you on China. We can go to Jean. Whoever has a quick answer to this, let's go ahead.
Well, I think, I mentioned that, for me, the fundamental thing that I'd like to say to the next administration is focus on the economic competition, not the ideological competition, and not who is the leader of China and can we change the leader and then everything will be different, as Jean was hinting at in the case of US-Russia relations. So I guess that's enough. That's my quick answer.
Good. Evan, the one misconception.
Well, as my former boss, the State Department, Rich Armitage, used to say, if you want to get China right, you got to get Asia right.
Yeah.
Competing with China is not rocket science. You got to shape the environment around them by working with partners, setting the standards, setting the norms, and being actively engaged. That's what the next administration needs to do.
Jean.
Well, at the risk of sounding overly academic or pompous, no offense to our academic colleagues, I would say, in thinking about the relationship with Russia, think about Russian history, think about Russian political culture, think about Russian geography, and don't assume that just because something changed in 1991, it became Russia, not the Soviet Union, the country will change fundamentally. There are these things that carry over political regimes, centuries, and so on. So I think that should be our going-in assumption.
Right. I mean, I'd only add one, which is the United States has vital national interests, but it may well be, I know it's heretical, it may well be that other countries too have vital national interests that need to be acknowledged and respected.
Amen.
By the United States. We have one more, so I want to do one question. It's just a one-word answer, so it should be easy. Who does Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi want to see as the next U.S. president? I just need a one word. If you want to mention a name and give me a one sentence why, we have time for that. So let's start with Jean.
Trump.
And the reason? I mean, yeah, I think it's pretty
The
self-explanatory.
Trump presidency has served Russian interests very well,
Yes,
willingly or not.
fair enough. Susan,
I think Putin definitely wants to see Trump. She, I think, is much more ambivalent.
there's a case to be made for Joe
Case
Biden.
to be made in his mind that Trump is beneficial to China over the long term, but also very difficult for them to deal with the unpredictability.
Fair enough. And finally, the last word, Evan, to you.
Chinese are very pragmatic in that sense. They'll deal with what they got. If I were a betting man, I'd say they'd rather have Biden. Predictability, stability, and despite what Trump they think is doing to American image in the world, they'd rather have that in the short term.
Got it.
I bet.
Listen, I mean, I can't thank the three of you enough. It's been an incredible, I learned a ton. It's been an incredibly rich conversation. I was right in assuming that the three of you have this extraordinary ability to get up above the clouds with a lot of thematic altitude, put things in context, and yet drill down on the granular that drives Russia and China's relationship with the United States. So, Susan, Evan, Gene, thanks so much. And to everyone out there, thanks for calling in, participating, and stay tuned for the next Carnegie Connects, which will be happening sooner than you think. Take care.
Thanks.
Over and out.
Thank you.
Good to see you.